Hi, I'm investigative journalist Peter Gagan, and welcome to Democracy for Sale. This week, we revealed that Labour Together, the really influential think tank behind Keir Starmer's rise to power, had spent at least £30,000 hiring private investigators to investigate journalists. These were journalists who had been actually digging into Labour Together's finances, and not just into their finances, but into the money that was used actually to get Keir Starmer into the leadership position in Labour back in 2020. I think it's a really important story. I think it's one that kind of cuts to the quick of how power and influence and money work in Britain and British politics. So today I've brought on Paul Holden. Paul is a very experienced investigative journalist. He's also the author of an excellent book, The Fraud, which is all about the story of Labour Together in many ways, and Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer. But not only that, Paul was one of the journalists that was targeted by this PR firm, APCO Worldwide, that was investigated for and to try and identify his own investigations, who was talking to him. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Like, how did you? Let's just start with the revelations. Like, what do you make of this?
I mean, it's very disturbing. I mean, at a personal level, it's obviously quite unsettling. And obviously it's quite difficult to tell my family about the sort of stuff happening. They're coming under a microscope because of our work. And but at the same time, I'm also a little bit unsurprised. Um, because I've been investigating this political project for 4 years now, really getting to the grips with the ways in which Morgan McSweeney works, and sort of Keir Starmer's rise to power, the way in which Labour Together, particularly the role that it plays in that rise to power, and I've come away very disturbed. I've come away very disturbed from like a both as an investigative journalist, but also all of my work up until date has been really about grand corruption and state capture, and just like this deep, really profound governance issues around the way in which Keir Starmer came to power, what role Labour Together played in it, and how I think they're quite a disturbing influence on our democracy. So obviously very upset, personally very, it's something to try and get to grips with. It's not stuff that you ever want to hear. That people are digging into to you and who you relate to, and that there's sort of stuff being done to try and nobble you and nobble your investigation is always very unpleasant. At the same time, it just feels like, I mean, at this point, are we really going to expect anything different from these people?
It's quite striking as well. Like, we obtained documents, we obtained reports, we saw reports that had been written by somebody at APCO who was leading this work. So for Labour Together, memos produced for Labour Together. So just to put this into context, this is a political think tank that had received huge amounts of donations in 2018, 2019, 2020, when it was run by Morgan McSweeney, who is now currently, as we're recording, the right-hand man to Keir Starmer. This money was used to pay for polling. It was used to pay for campaigning effectively for Keir Starmer, but it was done on the quiet. And these donations weren't declared in time. So Labour Together was later fined. And you had
Mhm.
been really digging into this, reporting around it, and also with Gabriel Pogrund at the Sunday Times, where some of your material had come out as well. And in the wake of that material coming out in 2023, Labour Together took what I think is an incredible decision to go and pay, to find and pay a company that effectively does private intelligence, private investigations. And I call it a PR firm in a piece, but it could be called many things. And one of the documents we saw talks a lot
Mhm.
about you specifically. It talks about where
Mhm.
you worked before. It casts aspersions about you. It says, Shadow World Investigates, the investigative newsroom that you co-run with Andrew Feinstein, that you'd taken money from George Soros. And again, like a kind of veil of, without actually any solid
Yeah.
allegations about any of this, and suggesting all of these things about you. That's very unsettling, but also it's very worrying, I think.
What they shows two things to me. First of all, um, is they were really scraping the barrel to try to find anything that could be used. Taking like the tiniest little fragments of my biography and then trying to sort of misrepresent them in the most sort of scurrilous possible way. I look at the way they sort of characterize me and my work, and obviously they're leaving out lots of very important details, like the fact that I've published in the Guardian before, I've published with Der Spiegel, I've published with Al Jazeera, I've published 6 books up until now. My work is being used by multiple law enforcement agencies to pursue grand corruption cases. 2 years ago, I was sitting in the room with the Department of Justice, helping them put together deferred prosecution agreements that actually led to a $250 million fine against SAPS. My work goes and it feeds into like serious multinational corruption stuff. What it also shows to me, I think actually this is the most important politically, is that I think it shows the extent to which they were scared. They were scared by this reporting. They were scared by the fact that people were digging into this money. And I think they were right to be scared that people were digging into this money because really, this is a proper scandal. And it's a proper scandal that I don't think is ever going to go away until it's properly dealt with by authorities. So if I may, I'll set out some of the sort of the broad points of what the scandal is that between December 2017 and April 2020, Morgan McSweeney is the company secretary for Labour Together. During this time, Labour Together is affecting in the public domain that it is this think tank, this anodyne think tank, trying to unite the Labour Party's various warring factions. When in fact, as we now know, it was engaged in like quite a devious campaign of subterfuge to try and undermine the prospects of the Labour Party winning in the 2019 general election potentially. There's this document they distribute internally and they list their threats to their project to what they say is renew the Labour Party, which is really just actually to capture the Labour Party for their faction. One of the threats they list is a Labour Party government victory. If there's a Labour Party government in power, then their project can't succeed, which is very profound. It's very profound that you have currently cabinet ministers sitting in Keir Starmer's cabinet who apparently received this document which said that we are worried that there's going to be a Labour government because it means we won't succeed in our factional projects. That's very disturbing. But then this money. So there's £730,000 that is not declared in line with electoral law. And it's very clear. It's absolutely clear. If you receive a donation that's over £7,500 and you're a members association, which is what Labour Together is, then you must report those donations. And they don't. And that's not conjecture. They definitely don't. And they were found guilty by the Electoral Commission of not reporting those donations in 2021 and effectively given a slap on the wrist. They were given a very small fine and an enforcement.
Which I just interject there, Paul, as someone who reports on it so much, is very much the case. We see this with breaches of electoral law as well. You see, like in the case of Labour Together, what's £14,000. These are
Yeah.
tiny sums against the £730,000. And we see this time again where the fines are just paltry. One MP actually once described it as the cost of doing business to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely minuscule, especially in light of what we actually know what the money was used for. And again, I'll come to it, but some of the concerns I have about the nature of that investigation that was performed. So when they were investigated by the Electoral Commission, effectively Labour Together, who've never properly explained what happened, and the Electoral Commission has really failed us by being totally untransparent about their own investigation. They effectively said this was an administrative oversight. Effectively, they just forgot to report £700,000 in donations. And if I may, and it's a bit of a tangent, I was really struck recently about the Peter Mandelson revelations about Jeffrey Epstein. And one of the things that Keir Starmer said in cabinet was, apparently Epstein paid $75,000 to Peter Mandelson. And Peter Mandelson says, I don't recall this. And Keir Starmer says, people say they don't recall $75,000 in payments is why people don't trust politicians. I'm like, well, your chief of staff forgot to report £730,000 in donations. It seems like that's to say you can make the same complaint about him. Now, I have real concerns about whether that's true, about whether it's true that this was just a big error and it was a big mistake. And the reason I think that is twofold. One is because I did an FOI into the Electoral Commission in 2023, and they disclosed to me a set of documents which I think are pretty damning. And what it shows is that at the end of 2017, while Morgan McSweeney's company secretary, he called the Electoral Commission and he said, I don't think that we're a campaigning organization. We're not public facing. I don't think we're a members association. I don't want to report donations anymore. And the Electoral Commission says, that doesn't sound right.
And this is put this in the context, Paul, again, step back. It's like this is a time when they're conducting opinion polling to figure out what Labour members think. So they basically effectively, that was a key part, really central actually to the Starmer project. They're hosting internal meetings, they're building networks, they are doing a lot of stuff that anybody would think of as really as properly political work and actually completely tied to a political project.
Yes, and actually, I think that was one of the things that was quite interesting about Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire's book, which is I didn't, they obviously have a bit of an inside track that I don't on some of the stuff, and they were pointing out actually the number of campaigns that Morgan McSweeney and Labour Together were supporting in the Labour Party at the time. That some of this polling material didn't just go to Keir Starmer, went to other candidates who were fighting internal selection battles in the Labour Party. This is plain that this is campaigning work, right? Now, the key thing is that the Electoral Commission writes back to Morgan McSweeney and sends this very clear email and says, no, you are a members association. As a members association, you have to report every donation. Every donation of above £7,500 has to be reported. This is the form that you have to fill in to report it. And then we see this extended period of time in which Morgan McSweeney, this period of about a month, where Morgan McSweeney is talking to this Electoral Commission employee about making another donation report. So it's absolutely incontrovertible that Morgan McSweeney knew that he had to report donations. That is not deniable anymore. So then the question becomes how reasonable is it to believe that a man who was compass mentis enough to be the chief of staff to the prime minister, is apparently this great political genius, was compass mentis enough to call the Electoral Commission and try and make an argument about why he didn't want to report donations, suddenly after being told that he had to report donations, they just forgot about it. And what makes it even harder to believe is that over a period of time thereafter, Labour Together constantly told people in the public domain that they were reporting donations. So in February 2019, they do a takeover of Labour List, and they update their website. And Labour Together's website says, we're a small membership. We're not a members organization, which is actually not true. They're a members association. We're not a faction. We're funded by small donations. Click here on this link to go have a look at the Electoral Commission's website to see the donations that we are funded by. But they weren't declaring any of those donations. And again and again and again, this happens. In February 2020, Shabana Mahmood, now the Home Secretary, writes an article for Labour List where she says Labour Together is a great organization. You should really, really, really trust it. One of the things I'm going to tell you about is Labour Together's funding. It says literally in this article, point 3, who funds Labour Together? And it says, go have a look at the Electoral Commission's website and it'll show you who's funding Labour Together. And it's not true. Because by the time she publishes that article, Labour Together has failed to report £638,000 in donations. So what are we supposed to believe here? We're supposed to believe that a man who's told he has to report donations, who's telling everyone in the public domain that he is reporting donations repeatedly over 2 years, forgot to report donations, right? And that's the substance of the story. And that's why they're investigating me, right? Because I'm saying, hold on a second. I basically got hold of documents from the Electoral Commission and my own leak saying this doesn't hold together. I don't think this is true. I think it's just as plausible that Morgan McSweeney purposely didn't declare these donations because it meant that he didn't have to suffer any scrutiny and he could act freely behind the scenes without being disclosed. And he could procure the cooperation of people in his political project. Right. And we actually had that from somebody like Neil Lawson, who's the director of Compass, very well respected guy, who has written explicitly about how, in the same period while Morgan McSweeney is not reporting donations, Morgan McSweeney was telling him all sorts of things about his political project which were not true, in order to procure Neil Lawson's cooperation in his political project. Right. Now, the other thing that I think Labour Together were genuinely terrified of, absolutely genuinely terrified of, is one of the documents which has been published, and you can go read it now. I think it's, if you Google the McSweeney files, you can see a copy of this document. And it's an absolutely bombshell document. And what it is, it's an email from Gerald Shamash to Morgan McSweeney. Now,
A
Gerald
lawyer.
Shamash
Yeah.
he's a lawyer, he's a
Yeah.
solicitor. And he's the solicitor that Labour Together hires when it's being investigated by the Electoral Commission. And it's this absolutely damning document. Because what Shamash basically does is he says, I'm setting out to you what your colleagues have told me happened in relation to this donation. So Shamash goes and he speaks to, again, I admit this is hearsay, so I'm saying what Shamash says. But Shamash says, I have gone to go speak to Steve Reed, who's obviously now the Cabinet Secretary for Housing and was a director of Labour Together while they weren't reporting this donations. And I've spoken to Shabana Mahmood, who he says was on the executive committee of Labour Together. And they've said that during this period of time, you made a decision not to report donations. Then he says, I've also done an investigation, and it seems to me, and this is the phrase I love, he says, we appear to have winkled out of the Electoral Commission that they do not have a record of your phone call with them, which is this phone call I've been talking about where he's told to report donations. And then it ends with, if you can't answer these questions, because none of these stories stack up, they don't make any sense whatsoever, right? He says, if you can't make sense of this, we're probably going to have to tell the Electoral Commission that this was a mistake. Now, the other set of documents I have is some of the correspondence that was sent from Labour Together to the Electoral Commission. And it's very clear after their conversation, they went back to the Electoral Commission and they didn't disclose the content of their phone call. And they said this was just an administrative error. Now, I don't know what happened after that point. It's a very frustrating thing. But I have serious, real material concerns. And not only is it possible that this money wasn't reported properly, but then when they were put under investigation by the Electoral Commission, they weren't candid in their responses. Now, this is very, very severe stuff, right? My deep and abiding frustration is that since 2023, the Electoral Commission absolutely refuses to disclose anything about this investigation beyond a top-line summary of its findings. It refuses to reopen this investigation, which I find absolutely astonishing, because it's absolutely clear, just on what's available in the public domain, that the Electoral Commission could not have known the true nature of this political project and what it was doing by the time it investigated Labour Together. It simply did not have the facts at its disposal to make a meaningful finding on the true facts of the matter, right? And I've been going to the Electoral Commission and saying, under an FOI request, you have to disclose this information. There is no greater public interest than us knowing what the Home Secretary, what a cabinet minister, and the Chief of Staff told to you during a statutory investigation and whether it was true. I cannot think of anything that could be more plainly in the public interest as to establish why this money wasn't reported and what they told you when it was being investigated. This is plain, basic, good governance stuff, regardless of your political affiliation. There's money in politics, it wasn't declared, our Prime Minister is our Prime Minister because of this money. We deserve to know. So that's why I think Labour Together was scared.
And I think it's really striking. So what we revealed on Democracy for Sale in terms of the kind of the investigation into the journalists, into investigative journalists, into people like you and Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York at the Sunday Times, Henry Dyer, the Guardian's name was mentioned, people from Declassified and others as well. And it's really striking to me. It's when those stories start to break. So it's late 2023, before the 2024, and the timeline of this is really important. I think it can get a bit confusing, but the timeline is completely crucial. I think you've spelled it out well there too. So by late 2023, Morgan McSweeney is gone from Labour Together. He's now Chief of Staff for Keir Starmer, but he's still very involved in Labour Together, it's fair to say, because the projects are so similar. And this time as well, Labour Together is a huge funder of the Labour Party, which is very unusual. So money is going to Labour Together and then out to Labour Party, particularly during the general election, which is just to come. So these stories start breaking. Some of the stories that your material feeds directly into, the stories in the Sunday Times, really your material is key to that. You're publishing as well, you're publishing in different places. And that's when Labour Together decides we need to do something about this. And what they do is they bring in this company, APCO Worldwide, and they hire them to investigate you, to investigate the journalists, find out your sources, and to suggest that that you've discredited you guys in various ways.
At the end of 2023, when they've hired APCO to investigate me, Labour Together has sort of relaunched. Between 2021 and 2023, it effectively goes dormant, right? Because the motive force behind Labour Together was always Morgan McSweeney, and then it's relaunched in April 2023, and it's specifically relaunched as an adjunct of the leader's office, right? And they say explicitly in multiple interviews, Josh Simons, who your reporting has now revealed was the person who actually appears to have appointed APCO, gives interviews in the public domain repeatedly saying Labour Together is the provisional wing of Starmerism. So, for example, the first full statement of Rachel Reeves' economic philosophy and her plans for government is published by Labour Together. Right, when David Lammy writes a report about his idea of how he's going to run the Department of Foreign Affairs when he gets into power, which is called Progressive Realism, is published by Labour Together. Now, this is all being done, and of course, Labour Together is raising huge amounts of money internally, is writing policy, and is spending vast amounts of money, really very substantial amounts of money, backing a whole bunch of candidates in the general election that follows. So this is all happening. The investigation hiring APCO is happening at exactly the same time as Labour Together is being curated as this outside vehicle that's going to drive and write Labour Party policy. when it comes into power, and is effectively a kindergarten for potential Labour Party MPs. Because there's a whole bunch of people who are employed by Labour Together at this time who then subsequently go on, or who are listed as research fellows, who then go on to be elected as Labour Party MPs, get selected by the Labour Party. So this is not just like it's not incidental to Starmerism or McSweeney, this particular story. It is central. Literally, as they're using Labour Together to prepare for government. At the same time that they are raising all this money from multimillionaire donors, writing the policy for the next government, giving these very bolshy statements about how they're going to take power and the influence that Labour Together is going to have. They're also hiring APCO and looking into journalists and trying to kill the story. And I think it's really important. I've been speaking about the story till I'm blue in the face. The story is fundamental. The story is potentially fatal, I think, because this is the story that implicates not just Morgan McSweeney, it implicates Steve Reed, it implicates Lisa Nandy, who's a cabinet secretary. They're both directors of Labour Together at the time, and it implicates Keir Starmer. Because this money is used to get Keir Starmer elected. It pays for polling. That is that we know that Morgan McSweeney is working with Keir Starmer from July 2019, as he's not reporting donations, to prepare Keir Starmer's bid for the leadership. Rachel Wearmouth wrote a book at the end of 2024 about, I think it's called Landslide, about the Labour Party's victory in 2024. And she writes, for the last 6 weeks of 2019, during the Labour Party, during that general election, Morgan McSweeney spent every spare moment, 6 weeks, every spare moment, while he's employed at Labour Together, not reporting donations, preparing for Keir Starmer's leadership bid.
And I think that's the thing that's so striking, Paul. I think that's the thing that comes out from reading your book, from reading the reporting that Gabriel and Harry York did in the Times, from all of this. And that's the story that they're trying to kill effectively
Yeah,
by investigating the sources.
absolutely.
They're trying to kill that story.
Yeah. And sadly, it goes to some quite dark places because, I write about this a little bit in the book. So again, I think the timeline here is really important, and I wish I'd known about this APCO investigation at the time because it was such a weird experience for me personally. But we do that. I do that article at the end of 2023 with Campbell Pogrund, and Harry York, and I think it's a very good article. Comes out and makes a bit of a splash, and then immediately thereafter, I'm contacted by the Telegraph, a very good journalist there called Claire Newell, who led a whole bunch of very high profile investigations. Said, "Oh, I'd really like to work with you on a follow up. Let's do it together." I said, "Great, let's do it." And it's at that point, it's a month after the Sunday Times article. Part of the problem we had the Sunday Times article is that they were like, "Well, we need to corroborate certain things. Let's corroborate certain facts," which is why I did the FOI into the Electoral Commission, right? And it's in December 2023 that I get the FOI from the Electoral Commission back that says, "Oh, it looks like you've been told you have to report donations." And then in February 2024, the Telegraph, in January 2024, sorry, the Telegraph is sending writing replies to Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney saying, "We've got these FOIs, we're going to report you." And things go really weird at that point for me in ways that I'm totally sideswiped by them because I get an email and it says, that you are being there's an allegation that you are being investigated by the National Cybersecurity Center for being the recipient of Russian hacks. And I was like astonished, just like, where on earth is this coming from? Like, what a bizarre allegation to be making in relation to me. And I bat the allegation away, and it goes away. But now it makes a lot more sense to me. Now it makes a lot more sense in context because actually what was happening, I now know, was that as soon as my first work came out, and I think the key thing that's important is that, when the Sunday Times story came out, at the same time the Sunday Times story came out, my publisher put up a blurb saying, Paul Holden is publishing a book. It's called The Fraud. It's looking into Morgan McSweeney. It's looking into Labour Together. It's looking into their dodgy projects and how they're funded. It's looking into their money. And then 2 months after that, I'm being accused of being under investigation by the security services for being a recipient of Russian hacks, which is the maddest, insanest allegation if you know anything about my political history and the sort of work that I do. And then it turns out not just that there's a random allegation, but that I have been reported to security services by Labour Together.
On the back of the kind of which is incredible. No, I think, Paul, it's absolutely incredible. And the kind of the material that we saw contains elements of that. It's exactly that sort of supposition, and I think you can start to see how the work that was commissioned that Labour Together paid for by this firm, by APCO Worldwide, fed into what you were experiencing.
I mean, that's very interesting for me because it, it also there's like a dark humor to it as well. There's like I find it a little bit bleakly funny because on the one hand, it's like it's extremely disturbing. Like it's really disturbing that you have an organization like this paying this firm to go dig into me and try and generate an allegation against me that will then make people question my reporting. But the allegation is so absurd. Like, I mean, a part of me feels like obviously I'm extremely angry with Labour Together, and I will be doing everything I can to make Labour Together disclose exactly what they were paying for and what they did and who they were telling about this sort of stuff and what they were saying about me behind closed doors. But at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, you guys were really ripped off. Like £30,000 for this. This is nonsense. And like it's nonsense that doesn't even like pass like the most basic sniff test. I mean, me and my colleague Andrew have been sued by Russian oligarchs. We've investigated Russian oligarchs. Jacob Zuma, I mean, my colleague Andrew Feinstein, is the first state witness in the corruption prosecution of Jacob Zuma, who was an ally of Vladimir Putin. Me and Andrew did campaigning work to make sure South Africa didn't sign a nuclear deal with Russia. Like when we told people in South Africa that this was the allegation, they laughed and they laughed and they laughed. They were like, "This is madness." Now, I understand that I'm not well known in the UK. I really get that, and again, I don't want to make this the story too much about me. But in South Africa, like I have a bit of a reputation because I've done work, pretty high profile work, on pursuing like real serious cases of grand corruption, which is some of the work I'm most proudest of my life. I did this work with the Judicial Commissioner of Inquiry in South Africa, where I helped trace all this money that had been stolen by Jacob Zuma and his family and this family called the Guptas, and it's allowed South Africa to recoup about like $1 billion in fines and asset seizures. It's like really important stuff. So when I go to South Africa and I tell people these stories, they're like, "This is utterly mad and insane and stupid." And also, a lot of my journalist friends are like, sounds like you can make a lot of money really easily working for APCO Worldwide, doing not very good work.
Well, thank you so much. I guess the one thing I wanted to circle back on before we go is like the kind of what happens next to this, because there's a world in which like we're recording this, Keir Starmer is on a very sugary peg, Morgan McSweeney even more so. But I'm struck that the person who was running Labour Together when this happened was Josh Simons, who's an MP, who is a Cabinet Office Minister, and that Labour Together has, as you've mentioned this already, is like very close. It's been closely aligned with serious people in the Labour Party, in terms of like it's funded
Mhm.
David Lammy, Steve Reid. These are people who and also been involved internally with the workings of Labour Together. Like it feels like it's a story that goes beyond in some respects Starmer and McSweeney as well. These are not, if these two people go, this is not the end of the story, at least where I'm sitting.
No, no, it really isn't. And I think, one of the things I write about in the book is that Labour Together, in their own mythology and their own legend, when they publish stuff in 2023 and they relaunch, they refer to these brave eight MPs who founded Labour Together. I call them the Brave Eight, as my sort of as my description of them. And it's the most senior people. This Brave Eight created Labour Together as part of this grand project of retaking the Labour Party and delivering Keir Starmer to power. And it's the most senior people in Keir Starmer's cabinet who are part of this Brave Eight. It's Wes Streeting, it's Lucy Powell. Sorry, I can even start that again. It's Wes, because Lucy Powell isn't there. I just checked that the other day. It's Wes Streeting. Um, it's people like Rachel Reeves. It's Steve Reid. These are very, very senior people. This is, as I say in the book, this isn't all the way that matters. This Labour government is a Labour Together government because all of the most senior roles are filled by people who are associated with Labour Together from 2017 onwards, benefited from this Labour Together McSweeney project, then use Labour Together as its policy shop to develop its policies. So, a very good example, digital ID, which has been announced, is a Labour Together policy. And when Keir Starmer announced that he was going to introduce Labour digital ID ahead of Labour Party conference, he did so at a very flashy event where Labour Together's logo was there and Labour Together were acknowledged as the brains trust behind this, right? So this is a Labour Together government in all the ways that matter. And as such, I feel like, and I write this in the book, they're all tainted to some degree or other because they're all the fruit of this poison tree. And this poison tree is this money they didn't declare, which they then use to take over the Labour Party in order to take over the state. And as we now see, the consequences of what it is to have a project like this, which I think, we haven't spoken about the nature of this project, but one of the things that I'm disturbed by is this is a project that seems to me, based on what we've been talking about, my investigations, is not averse to the dark arts, doesn't appear to have a huge amount of respect for the law, because if they did have respect for the law, they would have abided by it. And I've seen in South Africa what happens when you have states where you've had people who've broken the law in power. It's very problematic and it's very damaging, and it creates all sorts of very problematic, malignant outcomes in the long term. So this is actually, one of the things that we have to do, and one of the things that I'm planning to do after this book has been, be properly advertised, and this sort of media circus finishes, is the next stage is like the hard accountability work. It's going back to the Electoral Commission and saying to them, look, you have to reopen this. Look, you have to release this information. If you don't do this, we'll do a judicial review of it. There are steps that we will take. This doesn't just die with media stories. We will pursue this, and I will pursue this, like we do in South Africa when we uncover stuff like this. We pursue it till the end of the line. And at the end of the line, I hope the institutions of our democracy that we rely on finally get their act together and do their job.
Thank you so much for appearing today. It's been so good to talk to you. I would highly recommend people reading your book. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. You can read the story on Democracy for Sale as well. I should say actually that John Trudis, one of the founders of Labour Together, actually described it as dark. When I told him about this story, he said on the record, "This is dark shit." I think it's I would concur and suggest people have a read of that too. But Paul, thank you so much for coming on today and talking to me.
Let's inject some sense into proceedings. Peter Gagan, the editor of the Democracy for Sale Substack.
Democracy for Sale Substack.
The organisation Democracy for Sale.
Investigative journalism.